Welcome, dear listener, to another Quiet Corner Time brought to you by the Sleepy Historian, where boring history isn't boring at all. It's simply slow enough to drift off to. If this kind of soft-spoken storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to gently tap the like button and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And if you're feeling awake enough, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to imagine who else out there is slowly dozing off to the same ancient tales. So, dim the lights, fluff your pillows, let the candlelight flicker across embroidered velvet, and let the secrets of royal fashion begin to softly unfold. Tonight, we wander into the whispering stone halls of medieval castles, through thick tapestries, long candlelit corridors, and the rustle of heavy gowns trailing across cold stone floors. Our focus? The queens, and more specifically, what on earth they wore. Now, this isn't a fashion show. Not quite, but rather a quiet unraveling of history through silks and sapphires, through embroidery and elegance. You see, every fabric a medieval queen touched, every jeweled pin in her hair, every stitch of gold thread across her bodice, all of it told a story. A story of power, of lineage, of diplomacy, and at times, of rebellion. Did you know that a deep crimson hemline could signal her status? Or that the shimmer of her sleeves might be spun from real gold? It wasn't just about beauty. These choices were strategic. Clothing served as a soft weapon in the quiet wars of influence and perception. Some queens wielded their wardrobes with the same precision others wielded swords. And if you've ever stood in a museum, gazing at a faded gown behind glass, perhaps embroidered with strange animals or delicate vines, you may have wondered, why this pattern? Or, what did this color mean back then? Tonight, we'll answer those quiet questions. We'll learn how queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just influence politics. They shaped European fashion for generations. We'll uncover how accessories like gloves, belts, and even the placement of jewels acted as a language. And we'll spend time with the tailors, the embroiderers, the silent hands behind the seams, whose anonymous work stitched status into every fold. This is boring history for sleep. This is bedtime relaxation through gentle storytelling. So allow the sounds of medieval courts to settle around you, the slow creak of wooden beams above, the soft murmur of linen skirts on limestone, the hushed clink of jewels in candlelight. We're not in a rush. The story will wait for you. Now let's begin. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a medieval great hall, the air cool and fragrant with beeswax and aged wood. The light filters in through narrow windows, falling in angled beams across stone floors and woolen tapestries. At the far end of the room, a queen moves slowly toward her throne. But before you even see her face, you see her garments. In the Middle Ages, before a word was spoken, fabric spoke for you. The material draped around a queen's shoulders was more than just decoration. It was a proclamation. Silk, imported at great cost through winding trade routes from Byzantium or even further east, shimmered with a softness that no wool or linen could match. It whispered of diplomacy and opulence. Velvet, thick and lush, didn't merely warm the skin. It padded prestige. It announced wealth to anyone within sight. Now imagine for a moment a queen's cloak made of deep crimson velvet, edged with fur from the rare stoat, known as ermine. This was not simply warmth. This was symbolism. In the court's unspoken language, ermine was purity. Crimson signaled royalty. To wear both was to declare, I am sacred and sovereign. Most people in medieval Europe, especially peasants, would live and die without ever touching such cloth. Their garments were homespun, simple, functional, linen and coarse wool. But queens? Queens wore the world. Across the medieval period, as trade expanded and crusades connected faraway lands, new fabrics arrived in Europe. Damask from Damascus, brocade from Byzantium, and cloth of gold literally woven with metallic threads. These weren't simply purchases. They were prizes. A roll of silk could represent alliances with Venice or Constantinople. And once in the royal tailor's hands, these precious bolts were transformed into gowns heavy with meaning. But it wasn't just the fabric, it was how much of it. Sumptuary laws across Europe actually tried to restrict how much fabric could be used in a gown's train. Imagine that. A queen's influence measured by the length of her hem. In one English court, the rule stated that no train could trail more than 2 feet behind a noblewoman, unless she was of royal birth. Queens then glided across polished stone with trailing silks, their movement slow and ceremonial. Gold thread, a marvel in itself, was often couched onto fabric, that is, laid flat and stitched down instead of sewn like normal thread. Why? Because it was actual gold, hammered into thin strands and wound around silk cores, too precious to waste with full stitches. When sunlight or candlelight hit such embroidery, it flickered like fire, a visual echo of divine right. And yet, even within wealth, fashion moved. Early medieval queens, such as in Carolingian court, wore tunic-style garments, modest and layered. By the 12th and 13th centuries, more fitted gowns emerged. And in the later Middle Ages, sleeves flared like wings, collars rose like towers, and layered surcoats created rich silhouettes that echoed architecture itself. Each transition marked more than a shift in taste. It reflected the currents of history: increased trade, shifts in court culture, rising competition among noble houses. To the modern eye, it may seem ornamental, but in its time, a queen's attire was her armor, her robe, her shield, her colors, her crest. No thread was random, no drape was accidental. Even when queens wore mourning black, that, too, was a message. In an age where color dyes were laboriously extracted from crushed insects, rare plants, and costly minerals, every hue bore weight. Blue, the color of piety, was sourced from lapis lazuli. Green, for fertility. And purple, oh, purple, so difficult to produce that only the richest could wear it. A queen in purple stood apart, almost sacred, touched by imperial tradition. So, next time you imagine a medieval queen, don't just picture the crown. See the fabric that holds her story. Let the folds of silk whisper her rank. Let the embroidery sing her alliances. Let the colors hint at what she was trying to say, without ever uttering a word. And remember, for those who live by image impression, the cloth was the message. Imagine yourself once again, not as a queen this time, but as a guest at court, perhaps a foreign noble or a curious courtier, attending a feast beneath soaring arches and flickering torchlight. The moment you enter the great hall, your eyes are drawn not to the food or the music, but to the vibrancy of color that envelopes the room. Each hue is more than a personal preference. Each garment is a coded message. In medieval society, color was currency, symbolism, and power stitched into fabric. To wear a certain color was not simply to wear something pleasing. It was to align yourself with meaning, tradition, and often law. This is a spectrum of status, painted not with brushstrokes, but with dyed silk and velvet. Deep red, a shade extracted painstakingly from madder root or crushed cochineal insects, wasn't just beautiful. It signified majesty. A queen wearing a red cloak did not merely want to be seen. She wanted to be understood. Red, in its richest form, symbolized authority and divine favor. It turned heads not through its brightness, but through what it represented. Then there was blue. Not just any blue, but profound, celestial shade drawn from lapis lazuli. Imported from far-off lands like Afghanistan, lapis was ground into pigment and dye, more costly by weight than gold. In religious iconography, the Virgin Mary was often depicted in blue, and so too did queens wear it to signal piety, wisdom, and sanctity. Blue was serene, spiritual, and regal. Green, in contrast, was a color of fertility, freshness, and youth. Often associated with springtime and renewal, green garments were particularly popular in courtly love poetry and among younger royals. A queen in green might be celebrating a birth or emphasizing her role as mother and nurturer to her people. White, too, held meaning, not just as a symbol of purity, but as a display of wealth. In an age before modern laundering, maintaining a pristine white garment was a privilege reserved for those with servants, resources, and indoor lifestyles. To wear white was the signal you didn't have to work. But perhaps no color held more mystique than purple. In Roman times, Tyrian purple, extracted from thousands of sea snails, had been reserved for emperors. That reverence carried into the Middle Ages. Though true Tyrian purple was rare by then, rich violet hues still retained their imperial legacy. To wear purple was to echo the ancient line of rulers, to whisper, perhaps, of divine blood. And these colors weren't applied casually. Dyes were expensive, the process labor-intensive. The knowledge of mixing and setting dyes was guarded like alchemy. Fabric was soaked, dried, and soaked again in vats of plant matter, minerals, or animal-based substances, some pungent and unpleasant to work with. The final product, a gown dyed a uniform, rich shade, was an achievement in itself. Beyond single color statements, royal garments also used combinations to speak volumes. Blue and gold, red and white. These weren't just complementary palettes. They were political tools, evoking family crests, dynastic heritage, or matrimonial alliances. You might notice embroidered patterns along the hem, vines, fleur-de-lis, or tiny lions. These weren't just decorative. They were heraldic, even when not in battle. Queens carried their coat of arms in thread. Their sleeves bore their family's legacy. Their collars whispered their alliances. And this language of color extended beyond clothing. Tapestries told stories not just through pictures, but through the color schemes of the characters. Seals and manuscripts used ink and color to convey rank. Even the stained glass in court chapels echoed these associations. Robes of saints in blue and red. Thrones flanked by violet curtains, halos and gold leaf. What one wore and how one wore it could determine where one stood in court, both literally and figuratively. And for queens, this was especially crucial. She was often watched, her appearance dissected not just by her courtiers, but by emissaries, nobles, and foreign visitors. Her clothing became part of diplomacy, part of ritual, part of the message the crown wished to send. And in that message, there was no room for mistakes. So the next time you see a medieval portrait, perhaps of a queen in a stiff red gown, holding a lily and seated beneath a gold-trimmed canopy, look closer. See the dye. See the symbolism. See the statement. Her clothing was not merely chosen. It was crafted, layer by layer, thread by thread, color by color, into a visual declaration of her place in the world. And through that spectrum, we glimpse not only fashion, but the very structure of medieval society. Picture, if you will, the slow passage of centuries, not in wars or grand events, but in the rustle of silk skirts, the changing length of the sleeve, or the addition of a jeweled clasp. For medieval queens, fashion was not static, like the tides of kingdoms. It evolved gradually, beautifully, and often imperceptibly, until what once adorned a monarch in the early Middle Ages would look quaint, even foreign, to her great-granddaughter 2 centuries later. In the early medieval period, the influence of the Roman Empire still lingered in the folds of clothing. Queens often wore long tunics called blyouts, layered garments made of linen or wool, sometimes over simple underdresses. These gowns were loose, graceful, and practical, offering warmth in drafty stone halls. Belts or girdles at the waist provided definition, and often carried pouches, keys, or prayer beads. The cuts were straight, the colors muted, and ornamentation minimal, often just a border of embroidery or a delicate brooch fastening the neckline. Hems were long, but not so long as the trail, as queens still walked among courtiers, inspected kitchens, or even helped tend to matters of state. But as the centuries turned, fashion began to narrow and elongate. Garments hugged the body more closely, echoing the growing Gothic influence in architecture and art. Sleeves became fitted, then dramatically flared, trailing across the floor in a cascade of fabric. Dresses acquired trains, and necklines deepened in elegance, framed by fur-lined collars or stiffened ruffs. By the high Middle Ages, opulence crept in, thanks to the Crusades and increased trade. Queens had access to silk from Byzantium, brocades from Persia, and fabrics dyed in vibrant new hues. The blyout gave way to the cote hardie and the surcoat. Layered dresses sometimes open at the sides to reveal contrasting undergowns. The famous sideless surcoat, a sleeveless overdress with wide armholes, was both stylish and symbolic. It showcased not only the queen's slender silhouette, but also her wealth through layers of expensive cloth beneath. These garments became canvases for artisans. Imagine a queen standing atop a castle balcony, her outer gown of sapphire silk, shimmering subtly in the sunlight. Along the hem, golden lions march, not real one, of course, but embroidered beasts stitched in metallic thread, representing her family's crest. Each lion took hours, sometimes days of careful work. And it wasn't only for appearances, it told a story. Anyone who saw her knew who she was, what line she came from, and which crown she supported. Headwear, too, followed its own curious evolution. Where once queens had worn simple veils, light gauze that fluttered like wings, they now donned structured headdresses. The wimple, which framed the face and covered the neck, was replaced in time by the hennin, a conical hat that extended up and away from the head, sometimes nearly a foot tall, often paired with sheer veils that flowed like banners in a breeze. These dramatic headdresses were more than frivolity. They kept hair clean in smoky rooms marked status, and followed strict guidelines about modesty and visibility. In many courts, only married noble women could wear certain types. The hennin wasn't just a fashion, it was a declaration. And as the Middle Ages waned, the late medieval period ushered in a truly extravagant era. Dresses grew even grander. Bodices were stiffened with whalebone or reeds. Sleeves became padded, decorated with pearls and small bells. Necklines plunged, not provocatively, but in a carefully balanced blend of display and demureness. Trains stretched behind queens like flowing rivers, sometimes carried by attendants. Sumptuary laws, regulations on who could wear what, also grew stricter. These laws declared which fabrics and colors were restricted to royalty. A duchess might wear velvet, but only a queen could wear ermine fur or cloth of gold. Violating these laws wasn't merely a fashion faux pas. It could be seen as a challenge to authority. And so, queens wore their dresses with awareness, conscious of every thread, every hue, every fold. Her wardrobe was her armor, her diplomacy, her faith. And it changed, not overnight, but like the slow shifting of seasons, each layer adding to the story of who she was and how she ruled. From the simplicity of linen shifts to the grandeur gowns that took months to make, fashion followed queens through coronations, feasts, pilgrimages, and mourning. Their clothing bore the weight of ceremony, motherhood, widowhood, and the unrelenting scrutiny of court life. Even now, centuries later, we trace the lines of their gowns in illuminated manuscripts. We marvel at preserved garments in museum glass. We see their echoes in modern runways, royal weddings, and the silver screen. But back then, beneath all the lace and velvet, there was still a woman, perhaps adjusting a pin, brushing a spot of dust, or stealing a moment's breath before the great hall doors opened and all eyes turned to her. And so, fashion marched forward, gown by gown, century by century. Imagine yourself walking through the cool, echoing halls of a medieval castle. Tapestries sway ever so slightly from the draft, and your footsteps are muffled by thick rushes on the stone floor. In a great chamber at the heart of the royal residence, a queen sits not in solitude, but in subtle radiance, and it is not her gown alone that commands attention. Upon her brow, her neck, her hands, and her wrists shimmer traces of light, carefully placed reflections of wealth, faith, and lineage. These were not mere ornaments. These were messages, told in gold and gem, for all who had eyes to see. Jewelry in the medieval period was not created merely to please the eye. For queens, every item had meaning, and every meaning had weight. The crown was, of course, the most potent of all. More than a symbol of rulership, it was the visible expression of divine right. A queen's crown, smaller, more delicately adorned than a king's, often bore religious symbols, like crosses or fleur-de-lis, and was sometimes lined with ermine to signify purity and authority. The very act of donning a crown, even a modest coronet at a feast or procession, was a reaffirmation of status and sacred duty. But jewelry extended far beyond this singular object. Necklaces, often formed to link medallions or set with precious stones like sapphires and rubies, carried symbolic weight. A sapphire represented not just wealth, but piety and wisdom. A ruby might be chosen for its association with power or protection. Some queens wore necklaces bearing pendants of saints or relics of the Holy Cross, statements of devotion that also protected the wearer in times of childbirth or travel. Rings held personal and political importance. A queen's signet ring might bear her family crest or motto, use to seal letters and decrees with a wax stamp. Some rings were worn not for beauty, but for the healing power believed to reside in certain stones. Amethyst, for example, was thought to guard against illness and intoxication. Garnets were worn for strength in battle. Even though queens rarely fought, they often gifted such rings to their sons or husbands as tokens of support and protection. Even earrings, which grew more popular in the later Middle Ages, became a subtle language of wealth and fashion. While early medieval styles shied away from exposed ears, later queens wore pearl drops or delicate gold hoops, often as part of a broader ensemble coordinated with their gown's embroidery. One of the most revealing types of jewelry was the brooch, worn at the throat or shoulder, used to fasten cloaks or veils. Brooches varied in design, from simple discs to intricate filigree, and they told stories, religious narratives, scenes of saints, or heraldic symbols passed through generations. To see a queen's brooch was to glimpse the lineage she carried, the alliances she honored, and the dynasty she protected. And there were girdles, elaborate belts worn over gowns, often studded with gems and hung with chains, keys, or symbolic pendants. Some girdles bore engraved prayers or charms, believed to safeguard fertility and ensure a safe pregnancy. Queens often gifted such belts to noble women at court, especially upon marriage, as blessings in metal and stone. The materials themselves carried significance. Gold, naturally, symbolized wealth, but it also had spiritual resonance, incorruptible, eternal, and radiant like divine light. Silver, cooler in hue, was linked with purity and discretion. Pearls, a favorite among queens, represented both chastity and grace, appropriate virtues for a woman expected to embody idealized forms of both. But access to these precious items was carefully guarded. Sumptuary laws regulated the use of certain stones and metals, ensuring that only royalty and select nobles could wear the finest jewelry. A merchant's wife might admire a golden ring in the marketplace, but she would risk severe punishment if caught wearing one beyond her station. For queens, however, these laws were not restrictions. They were affirmations. The exclusivity of their jewels reinforced the hierarchical fabric of society. Yet, it was not only about display. There is tenderness, too, in these objects. Some jewels were gifts from kings, tokens of affection or alliances. Others were handed down, mother to daughter, each new wearer adding a thread to the story. Some were worn only on feast days or in mourning, their appearance a visual diary of the queen's role as matriarch, diplomat, and sacred presence in court life. And even now, in museums and hidden vaults, these items remain tiny, glittering survivors of centuries, rings inscribed with prayers, necklaces worn at coronations, crowns that once graced the heads of women who shaped kingdoms, bore heirs, and weathered wars. These pieces do not merely survive because they are beautiful. They endure because they are meaningful. Because every gem, every clasp, every delicate filigree whispered something about the woman who wore it and the world she ruled. Imagine yourself standing quietly in the corner of a grand medieval antechamber. Sunlight filters through narrow stained glass windows, spilling colored shapes across stone floors. You hear the rustle of fabric, the hush of conversation, and the soft snap of leather. A queen is preparing to make her entrance, and though her gown gleams and her jewels sparkle, there is something more, subtle details that speak to those trained to listen. A belt clasped at her waist, gloves tucked just so into her palm, a fan dangling lightly from her wrist. These are her accessories, quiet, refined, and steeped in meaning. In the world of medieval fashion, accessories were not mere embellishments. They were symbols, tools, even silent statements of identity, wealth, and power. To wear them was to participate in a rich visual language, one that communicated rank, faith, readiness, and intention without a single word spoken. Let's begin with belts, also known as girdles. For a medieval queen, a belt was not simply decorative. It served a structural purpose, gathering layers of fabric and defining the body silhouette, but also functioned symbolically. Belts studded with gems or embroidery often featured religious inscriptions, or even small containers for holding holy relics. Some included hanging keys, denoting the queen's dominion over domestic space and royal treasuries. A belt material and weight could also indicate occasion. Slim woven silk for daily use, ornate chain-link silver or gold for formal processions. Gloves, though sometimes overlooked, were deeply significant. A queen's gloves were often made from fine kid leather, velvet, or richly embroidered cloth. More than warmth or fashion, gloves conveyed dignity and spiritual cleanliness. In coronation rituals, gloves were donned before the queen received sacred regalia, signifying her readiness to govern with pure hands. To offer a glove to someone, even ceremonially, could symbolize favor or command. Many gloves were perfumed, a small detail, but one that left a gentle reminder of presence as a queen passed through the hall. Then there were fans, not yet the folding kind familiar from later centuries, but rather small, feathered tools held gracefully or attached to girdles by silk cords. Fans served both practical and symbolic purposes. In hot or crowded courts, they helped queens maintain composure and grace. But beyond cooling, the fan was a gesture of elegance. Its movement, slow, deliberate, became part of a queen's body language, a dance of discretion and poise. It is even said that some fans were gifted between noble women as tokens of sisterhood and secret alliance. Veils, too, were layered with meaning. A queen rarely appeared in public with her hair uncovered. Whether sheer linen or heavier brocade, veils conveyed modesty, chastity, and spiritual authority. The way a veil was draped, tightly wound or softly falling, reflected both the occasion and the personal style of the queen. And in certain contexts, a veil could signal mourning, humility, or reverence. To lift one's veil, even slightly, was an intimate gesture allowed only in the company of trusted kin or clergy. Consider purses and small pouches, worn at the hip or hidden within fold of a gown. These held more than coin. They carried rings, herbs, tiny devotional books, or even secret messages. Some purses were embroidered with symbols of protection or love, stitched with the care of handmaids or court artisans. A queen might present a pouch to a visiting dignitary as a gesture of welcome, or place a scented sachet within to keep her garments fragrant and clean. And we must not forget the shoes. Although often hidden beneath long skirts, royal footwear was carefully designed. Queens wore shoes of velvet or leather, sometimes dyed deep crimson or blue, colors difficult and costly to produce. Many were embroidered with pearls or lined with fur. Shoes signaled occasion as much as style, flat and simple for everyday movement within the palace, elevated and ornate for ceremonies, processions, and banquets. The glimpse of a jeweled toe beneath a queen's gown might spark admiration or whispers, depending on the viewer. Even hairnets and circlets played their part. Hairnets made of silk thread and gold wire preserved intricate hairstyles and demonstrated wealth. Circlets, slim bands of metal, were less formal than crowns, but still regal, worn at feasts or garden gatherings. A circlet embedded with sapphires might signify wisdom and constancy, while one adorned with emeralds might suggest renewal, fertility, or growth. Accessories were not chosen lightly. Every item, down to the tiniest clasp or embroidery thread, carried deliberate purpose. Artisans labored to craft these objects, and queens chose them to send signals, sometimes public, sometimes private, about allegiance, piety, availability, or power. We know of these items not only through manuscripts and paintings, but from archaeological discoveries. In tombs and hidden chambers, buried beneath centuries of dust, we find gloves preserved in cedar boxes, belts laid across decayed silk, brooches still clasped, waiting. Each find is a whisper from the past, a delicate thread of a story once told without a single word. Accessories may be small, but they are mighty in message. They tell us how queens move through their world, not with weapons or speeches, but with gesture and grace, carried on fingertips and fabric. Imagine walking into a quiet museum hall, the kind with dim lights and echoing footsteps. Glass cases line the room, their contents softly illuminated. Inside, resting against deep velvet, are the carefully preserved remnants of another world. A tiny shoe, no longer than your palm, a belt buckle of gilded bronze, a necklace whose emeralds still catch the light. These are not simply relics. They are portals to the lives once lived, particularly those of queens, whose adornments told their stories in glimmering, silent detail. Today, many of the accessories worn by medieval queens survive only in fragments. Time has not been kind to silk or leather, and even the finest lace disintegrates when left too long in damp soil. Yet still, the past leaves traces, buried beneath cathedral floors, tucked into monastery walls, or preserved in tombs untouched for centuries. In Westminster Abbey, for instance, a pair of embroidered gloves once belonging to a royal consort was found encased in a lead-lined coffin, wrapped in linen, remarkably intact. The gloves were stitched with delicate floral patterns, lined with fur, and decorated at the cuff with tiny golden clasps. Scholars believe they were funeral garments, worn for the last time in quiet reverence. Even in death, a queen was adorned with care. At the Museum of London, a small but exquisitely wrought silver mirror once used by a medieval noblewoman rests behind glass. It's portable, meant to fit into a pouch or drawer. The back is engraved with interlocking vines and a tiny Latin inscription, likely a personal motto or prayer. Such mirrors weren't merely for vanity. They were deeply symbolic, tied to the concept of self-awareness, morality, and divine reflection. A queen who possessed such a mirror was expected to not only maintain her beauty, but her virtue. Archaeological digs across Europe have unearthed a wide array of belt fittings, brooches, combs, and pendants, many buried with their wearers. In Saxony, a grave thought to belong to a high-ranking court lady revealed a beaded necklace of rock crystal and jet, materials once believed to offer protection from envy and illness. In another tomb in northern France, excavators discovered a wooden chest still clasped shut, Inside were remnants of cloth and a brass pin in the shape of a bird, a symbol of grace and freedom, perhaps worn in the queen's hair during festivals. It is in these quiet moments, standing before a glass case, holding your breath as you peer faded embroidery, that history feels most alive. Each item tells a story not of conquest or war, but of presence, of how queens lived, prepared, and presented themselves to the world around them. Some museums have taken to reconstructing entire royal wardrobes from these findings. Using paintings, descriptions, and surviving fragments, historians and textile experts recreate gowns layer by layer, from the underdress and chemise to the outer robe, belt, and veil. In these reconstructions, viewers can finally grasp the sheer weight of a queen's ensemble, not just in physical fabric, but in symbolism. A gown may weigh 10 pounds. Its meaning, far more. Many of these reconstructions appear in interactive exhibits. In Vienna, a digital display allows visitors to dress a virtual queen, choosing from various accessories and styles typical of the 13th to 15th centuries. With each change, a narration explains the significance. You have chosen blue, a color of piety, or this belt style was worn only by women of noble birth. It's a quiet form of education, guided not by textbooks, but by texture and hue. Beyond museums, manuscripts and paintings offer glimpses into the everyday wear queens. The illuminated margins of prayer books often depict women at prayer or in repose, their accessories clearly illustrated in miniature detail. Ivory combs, bejeweled clasps, and silk girdles. These illuminations, though idealized, were drawn from life. Artists captured not only the grandeur, but the intimate customs of courtly fashion. Modern historians even consult household inventories and dowry lists, which recorded every item a queen brought with her into marriage, from silver needle cases to amber rings. These documents, meticulously kept, reveal just how valuable accessories were and how much attention was paid to their curation and care. And yet, for all we've uncovered, much remains hidden. Many accessories have returned to the earth, lost to decay, fire, or plunder. Others were passed quietly from queen to daughter, hidden in the seams of gowns, or melted down to fund wars and debts. Still, what endures gives us a tactile link to the past. There's something remarkably personal about seeing a queen's ring or clasp. Unlike armor or crown jewels, which often feel distant and ceremonial, these smaller items feel human. They remind us that beneath layers of ritual and status, royal women live their lives much like anyone else. One clasp, one ribbon, one perfumed glove at a time. These fragments whisper across the centuries, inviting us not to witness glory or triumph, but to pause, to look closely, and to imagine the gentle rhythm of preparation, the soft rustle of silk, the glint of gold in candlelight. And in doing so, they remind us that history is not just grand, it is intimate. Imagine a queen standing at the top of a grand stone staircase, her dress, flowing in rich folds of crimson and gold, cascades around her feet like a banner. Courtiers gather below, the sound of murmuring voices and rustling fabrics echoing off high vaulted ceilings. In this moment, every eye is on her, not because of what she says, but because of what she wears. Throughout the medieval era, queens used fashion as a language of power. Before a single word was spoken in court, a message had already been delivered through the weight of silk, the shimmer of jewels, and the careful selection of color and cut. A queen's wardrobe wasn't just personal attire. It was a statement. To her husband, her people, her enemies, and to foreign visitors. Her clothing broadcasted wealth, legitimacy, alliances, religious devotion, and even fertility, all wrapped in a velvet gown or embroidered surcoat. Let's begin with color, perhaps the most instantly symbolic element. Rich hues like deep crimson, imperial purple, and shimmering gold were not merely decorative. These pigments were rare, expensive, and reserved for the elite. Purple, for example, required thousands of mollusks to create even a small amount of dye. To wear purple was to literally wrap oneself in wealth. It said, "I am untouchable." In contrast, blue, particularly a pale or cerulean shade, signaled piety and devotion to the Virgin Mary. Queens often chose blue gowns when appearing at religious ceremonies or on holy days, subtly aligning themselves with divine favor. Material was equally powerful. A gown woven with threads of gold was not just an extravagant choice. It was a political message. The very existence of such a garment demonstrated the queen's access to luxury, her kingdom's trade routes, and the wealth of her dowry or realm. In some cases, the gold threads were real, painstakingly spun from beaten metal and threaded to the fabric with silk. These garments were not made for comfort or ease of movement. They were made to dazzle. Then there was symbolism in embroidery and pattern. A queen's robe might bear motifs of lions, eagles, or fleur-de-lis, all carefully chosen for what they represented. Lions for courage and royal lineage, eagles for divine power, the fleur-de-lis for purity and dynastic legitimacy. These symbols could subtly reinforce the queen's rightful place at court or challenge her rivals without a single spoken accusation. In some cases, fashion was used to announce alliance or assert dominance. When Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of medieval Europe's most powerful queens, traveled between kingdoms, she wore garments crafted to reflect both her birthright and her marital ties. On diplomatic visits, she would appear in a blend of French and English styles, a visible reminder that her power extended beyond a single court. Consider the wedding garments of queens. These were not simply dresses, but public documents of union and strategy. Gowns were often designed to incorporate the heraldry of both the bride's and groom's families, with colors and emblems split or merged along the seams. The fabric itself might be imported from the groom's homeland, the thread spun by the bride's own attendants, every stitch a testament to cooperation or dominance. Even veil length and fabric weight could carry meaning. A heavy, trailing veil signified submission, not just to a husband, but to a greater political structure. A shorter, structured headpiece implied autonomy and strength. Over time, queens who became regents often adopted more austere and masculine silhouettes, subtly stepping into authority without breaking custom. And don't forget the ritual of dressing itself. A queen was not alone when she selected her gown. Her ladies-in-waiting advisors, and sometimes even clergy, were involved in crafting her daily image. Clothing was discussed in council meetings, approved by family members, and dictated by the demands of state. It was not simply fashion. It was diplomacy, doctrine, and duty. Take Isabella of France, who married Edward II of England. She famously wore a gown stitched with silver thread and lined with ermine fur when attending court during political upheaval. Her appearance, regal, composed, and shimmering in winter light, helped rally support during a time of uncertainty. The message was clear. The queen remains strong, even if the king does not. In private, queens had simpler garments, woolen dresses for cold mornings, linen shifts for sleeping. But in public, fashion was armor. It was strategy wrapped in silk. Every brooch and hemline told a story. And yet, fashion's power was double-edged. A misstep could spark scandal. A gown too revealing might invite whispers. Colors associated with mourning worn in celebration could appear tone-deaf or rebellious. A necklace absent from the queen's throat, if known to be a family heirloom, might cause speculation about strife, debt, or illness. Thus, the queen's clothing was a tightrope walk, balancing expression, tradition, and control. She had to be captivating, but never ostentatious. Pious, but not plain. Wealthy, but not wasteful. Her garments needed to satisfy not just personal taste, but the expectations of the people, the church, and the political machine she helped operate. In this way, fashion became one of her most effective tools, a silent yet eloquent form of leadership negotiation, and resistance. Through her wardrobe, she could sway perception, enforce policy, and strengthen her legacy, stitch by deliberate stitch. Picture yourself in the bustling heart of a medieval town, vendors calling out their wares, the scent of fresh bread and damp stone lingering in the air. Amidst the crowd, women and girls glance at a mural the Queen painted on a local chapel wall. Her image, immortalized in paint and gold leaf, is the very ideal of beauty and virtue. Her gown, her hair, her posture, all mirrored and admired. In the medieval world, queens were more than monarchs. They were symbols, fashioned into icons by the artists, poets, and clergy of their time. Their clothing didn't just express power, it created trends. What they wore echoed far beyond the palace walls and into the homes of nobles, merchants, and even peasants. Let us consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of history's most influential queens. As queen of both France and England during the 12th century, her fashion choices straddled not only geography but cultures. Known for her intelligence and political prowess, Eleanor was also famed for her bold fashion. She popularized fitted bodices, wide sleeves, and delicate, sheer veils that flowed like whispers. When she appeared at court, her garments combined French grace with English restraint, a deliberate act of unity between two often contentious realms. But more than that, Eleanor was aspirational. Her garments became the foundation for the courtly lady ideal. Noble women began mimicking her style, not just in dress, but in speech and manner. The literary tradition of the noble queen in velvet was inspired by women like Eleanor, and that image filtered into ballads, tapestries, and later, even stained glass windows. Another great influencer was Isabella Castile, who reigned in the late 15th century. Though known for her staunch Catholic faith and political resolve, Isabella also understood the silent language of garments. She often dressed modestly, choosing darker, solemn colors, but would switch to lavish gold-embroidered gowns during coronations or royal births, reinforcing her connection to both heaven and the state. Her clothing balanced austerity and majesty in a way that made her seem both divine and grounded. A queen of the people, yet touched by the sacred. Queens often inspired fashion, not just through their personal style, but by what they represented. In France, Anne of Brittany was depicted in manuscripts wearing layers of embroidered linen, fur-trimmed robes, and intricately woven coifs, each element blending local Breton customs with Parisian luxury. Her marriage united two regions, and her garments embodied that fusion. Fashion also trickled down through royal ceremonies. When a queen was crowned, married, or gave birth, the garments she wore were carefully recorded, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in church chronicles, and often in commissioned paintings. These public images were like medieval fashion magazines. Copies and reinterpretations followed soon after, and were the sumptuary laws. These regulations dictated who could wear what, and they were often enforced based on what the queen wore. If the queen adopted a new sleeve style, tailors across the country might see increased demand from noble women eager to imitate it. But if commoners began wearing colors or styles deemed too royal, the laws would tighten. Thus, queens indirectly shaped national dress codes. We can see this ripple effect clearly in the accessories of the time. Queenly fashion made elaborate headdresses, like the hennin or butterfly veil, all the rage among upper-class women. Intricately worked girdles, long trailing sleeves, and tightly laced bodices became symbols not just of beauty, but of elevated status. Even when garments themselves couldn't be copied, silhouettes and flourishes often were. Portraiture, too, immortalized queenly fashion. In frescoes and tapestries, queens are often shown seated regally, surrounded by flowers or religious symbols, their robes pooling around them like water. These images became templates. The same postures, patterns, and clothing motifs were reused for decades, influencing not just how people dressed, but how they imagined queens to look and act. And just as modern celebrities have stylists, medieval queens had their court tailors, embroiderers, and advisors who carefully curated their wardrobes. These artisans helped craft not just garments, but public images, visual narratives that whisper messages of strength, grace, piety, or fertility depending on the occasion. It's worth noting that many queens also served as patrons of the textile and fashion industries. Their commissions supported entire workshops, from weavers and spinners to goldsmiths and jewelers. Some queens even had their own dedicated embroidery rooms, where noble women gathered to stitch together political symbols into silk wall hangings and garments, blurring the lines between art, labor, and power. In time, these queens became fashion myths. Long after their deaths, their styles continued to appear in manuscripts and ceremonial dress. The idea of a royal look, a blend of dignity, opulence, and sacred femininity, became standard, and modern fashion still echoes it in wedding gowns, red carpet designs, and regal branding. So when we look at a queen's dress in a museum, heavy with gold thread, embroidered with heraldic emblems, perhaps lined with fur, we're not just looking at fashion. We're seeing a living symbol, one that shaped language, politics, art, and aspiration. A queen was never just a woman in fine clothes. She was an image, styled with purpose, worn with authority, and remembered through centuries of imitation. Imagine a hall filled with flickering torchlight, the gentle rustle of fabric echoing through the stone chamber. A queen glides past, her robe trailing behind her like a silent shadow, embroidered with symbols of her realm. Each step she takes is a silent declaration of lineage, authority, and the era in which she lives. Fashion in the medieval world was far more than personal expression, especially in the case of queens. It served as a mirror, quietly reflecting the values, struggles, and aspirations of society that surrounded them. In the early Middle Ages, royal fashion emphasized simplicity. Gowns were long and flowing, made of undyed wool or linen, and accessories were minimal. This reflected a world still rebuilding from the collapse of the Roman Empire, a world where scarcity and modesty were valued, even among the elite. Queens wore veils and cloaks that signified piety more than luxury, and garments often echoed monastic designs. But as trade expanded and prosperity grew, so too did fashion evolve. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the queen's wardrobe became a silent testament to a changing world. Trade routes from the Middle East and Asia brought silks, exotic dyes, and fine jewels into Europe. This explosion of material wealth led to a growing taste for luxury, especially among the elite. And who better to model this than the queen? Consider, for example, the shift in dress structure. Early gowns had wide, unshaped silhouettes. Later, gowns became more tailored, bodices tightened, sleeves elongated, and skirts layered. These changes coincided with the rise of the merchant class, who brought new materials and new wealth into cities. As society became more complex, so did the garments that represented it. A queen's clothing also reflected the growing importance of image and ceremony in medieval life. Court life became increasingly theatrical, with processions, banquets, and ceremonies requiring specific wardrobes. A queen might don crimson trimmed with ermine for a feast day, then appear in shimmering blue for a coronation. Each appearance was carefully choreographed to communicate loyalty, sanctity, or political allegiance. But fashion also revealed tension. As noble women and wealthy merchants began adopting styles once reserved for royalty, the line between classes blurred. This led to the enforcement of sumptuary laws, strict rules controlling who could wear what. These laws were less about fabric and more about preserving hierarchy. For queens, this meant their fashion had to evolve once again, subtly shifting toward more exclusive materials, rarer dyes, and symbols of divine right. During the 14th century, especially in France and England, fashion became more personalized. Queens began commissioning garments that included family crests, religious iconography, and even woven prayers. These custom garments turned the queen's body into a living tapestry of meaning, a sacred canvas draped in identity. At the same time, the Black Death swept through Europe, altering nearly every facet of society. Strangely, even amid such tragedy, fashion flourished. Some scholars suggest that the fleeting nature of life inspired a desire to leave a mark. And for queens, fashion was one way to do just that. Gowns became more opulent, sleeves longer, headpieces taller. It was almost as if dressing grandly was a form of hope or defiance against a world in mourning. In the later medieval period, the development of tailoring guilds and textile industries allowed more experimentation in cut and design. Queens no longer wore only imported luxury. They also supported local craftsmanship. This shift reflected the broader transformation of the medieval economy from feudalism toward early capitalism. The queen's wardrobe, once simple and symbolic, now had layers of meaning: political, spiritual, and economic. What she wore could influence trade. If a queen favored a certain fabric, merchants would scramble to import it. If she adopted a local dye or embroidery style, regional guilds would flourish. Furthermore, fashion reflected changing attitudes toward gender and power. While early medieval queens were often portrayed as passive consorts, later queens embraced their roles as regents, diplomats, and cultural patrons. Their fashion followed suit, evolving from modest veils to structured gowns, from neutral tones to commanding colors like imperial purple or scarlet. Their garments mirrored not just a changing society, but their growing presence within it. By the end of the 15th century, royal fashion had become almost theatrical. Layers upon layers, embroidered messages, religious motifs. These weren't just garments, they were statements. And for the people watching from afar, whether in bustling cities or rural hamlets, the queen's attire offered a glimpse into grandeur, values, and inner workings of their world. So when we say fashion was a mirror to medieval society, we mean it quite literally. The queen, cloaked in velvet, girdled with gold, veiled in silk, reflected not just herself, but an entire civilization's desires, beliefs, and transformations. Imagine, for a moment, a queen entering a grand cathedral. Light filters through stained glass, casting jewel-toned shadows across her path. Her gown shimmers softly, not just from the richness of the fabric, but from the silent messages it carries. Medieval queens didn't just wear fabric, they wore meaning. Every thread, every color, every stitch had a purpose. It was not merely fashion, it was language. Let's begin with the fabrics themselves. Silk, the most prized material, came from distant lands, most notably China, Persia, and later Byzantium. A queen's access to silk garments immediately conveyed her realm's wealth and far-reaching connections. Velvet, rich and textured, began appearing in royal wardrobes by the late 13th century. It was notoriously expensive to produce and difficult to dye evenly, making it a symbol of meticulous craftsmanship and exclusivity. But it wasn't just the type of fabric, it was what was woven into it. Heraldic symbols were common on royal attire, especially during official ceremonies. These symbols, lions, eagles, fleurs-de-lis, and more, were not just decorations. They spoke of alliances, dynasties, and ancestral claims. A lion embroidered on a sleeve might indicate the queen's marriage into a powerful house. A border of ivy or oak leaves might whisper fertility, renewal, or connection to nature worship. Some queens favored intricate embroidery along hems and cuffs. These narrow strips of fabric became miniature scrolls of information. Religious symbols were also common: crosses, doves, or depictions of saints, sewn into inner linings or hidden under collars. These were not visible to the public eye, but serve as private acts of devotion, stitched into the daily experience of power. Color was equally symbolic. Deep blue, extracted from lapis lazuli, was among the rarest and most expensive dyes, often reserved for depictions of the Virgin Mary in religious art. When a queen wore blue, especially in religious contexts, it suggested divine purity and favor. Red, particularly vermilion and crimson, was a mark of royal authority. Derived from cochineal or kermes insects, these dyes required thousands of creatures for even a small batch. A crimson cloak might signify bloodline and legitimacy, linking a queen's presence to the enduring strength of her dynasty. Gold thread, woven directly into fabric, wasn't merely decorative. It was real gold, flattened, spun, and sewn with care. Garments adorned with gold thread shimmered in candlelight and signaled not only wealth, but the divine nature of royal rule. After all, who but God's chosen could be wrapped in radiance? Then there were subtler signs, the way sleeves were shaped or where pleats fell. A narrow sleeve suggested piety and modesty. A dramatic sleeve, flowing nearly to the ground, hinted at wealth and luxury, as such fabric served no practical purpose and required constant care. Likewise, the train of a gown, its length and embroidery, often reflected the importance of the event and the social hierarchy present. Many garments included hidden linings of fur, often miniver, a white fur lined with gray. This fur, seen only when sleeves were lifted or cloaks opened, conveyed discreet luxury. It whispered, rather than shouted, about status. In some cases, queens even wore coded imagery, stylized flowers, animals, or geometric motifs that referenced family crests, political allegiances, or personal beliefs. A repeating rose pattern might signal ties to the House of Lancaster. A string of stars could suggest celestial favor or astrological guidance, popular notions in late medieval courts. Let's not forget the role of seasonal fabric choices. In summer, lightweight linens might be embroidered with floral designs, daisies for innocence, violets for loyalty. In winter, heavier brocades featuring holly, ivy, or pomegranate motifs were common, referencing eternal life and fruitfulness. And finally, we must look at the garments worn beneath. The chemise or underdress was often made of fine linen. While unseen, queens had theirs embroidered with prayers, blessings, or protective symbols. These were garments of intimacy, not meant to impress, but to safeguard. In moments of solitude, such as prayer or childbirth, these hidden embellishments became a quiet source of strength. All of this, the symbols, the fabric, the threads, formed a visual vocabulary. For a queen, being seen was never accidental. Her appearance was curated, thoughtful, and dense with meaning. At a glance, a viewer might notice a beautiful gown, but with a trained eye, one could read her entire political stance, family background, religious affiliation, and message of the day, all without a single word spoken. So next time you look at a medieval portrait or museum display, remember, those gowns were not just relics of beauty. They were manuscripts in thread, telling stories stitched across centuries. They held secrets, ones meant to be seen, understood, and remembered. Imagine a quiet morning in a medieval palace. The scent of beeswax candles hangs in the air. In a sunlit corner of the queen's private quarters, a seamstress threads her needle with steady hands, ready to begin another day's work on a royal garment. Fashion, especially in the life of a queen, was never a solitary act. Behind every gown, every accessory, every shimmering detail, was a network of skilled artisans and court personnel, each playing a role in crafting the royal image. These people didn't simply follow orders. They were artists, designers, and interpreters of power, all working behind the scenes. Let's start with the tailors and dressmakers, or as they were more commonly known, mantua makers and seamsters. Some worked within the royal household, while others belonged to respected city guilds and were summoned when needed. These specialists knew more than how to cut and stitch. They understood the nuances of court symbolism, the weight of protocol, and the expectations tied to every stitch. A misplaced color or motif might not just be a fashion error. It could be a political faux pas. Next came the embroiderers, whose needles moved with extraordinary precision. They specialized in embellishments that transformed a fine garment into something regal. Their work might include intricate vines crawling up a sleeve, tiny gold suns stitched into a bodice, or scenes from mythology carefully rendered in silk. Some embroidery workshops were staffed almost entirely by women, noble women themselves at times, who saw this as both an art form and a spiritual practice. Jewelry designers and goldsmiths also played a vital role. Crowns, tiaras, brooches, and necklaces were not only decorative, they were engineered for symbolism. A necklace with a sapphire pendant might be crafted specifically for a queen's appearance at a diplomatic banquet, chosen to reflect both elegance and fidelity. Artisans had to be fluent in gem symbolism, metallurgy, and storytelling. Then there were the wardrobe keepers, known in many courts as the mistress of the robes or similar titles. These women, often of noble birth, were entrusted with managing the queen's garments, recording, maintaining, and preparing them for every occasion. They worked closely with tailors, laundresses, and servants to ensure that the queen's wardrobe reflected her evolving role and circumstances, whether mourning, celebration, diplomacy, or religious devotion. Interestingly, queens often had fashion advisors, though not by that name. These were learned women or senior courtiers who understood not only current styles, but how those styles could be interpreted. A gown with foreign embroidery might be appropriate for a treaty signing, or it might raise suspicions of favoritism. These advisors were masters of subtlety. In some courts, special rooms were set aside for garment preparation, spaces known as robing chambers or dress halls. Inside, tailors and embroiderers worked under candlelight, surrounded by bolts of imported fabric, trays of pearls, and delicate scissors. Imagine the soft rustle of fabric as it unfurled, the quiet murmurs of collaboration, the scent of lavender sachets tucked between garments to ward off moths. Many garments were seasonal or ceremonial, worn only once or twice. Afterward, they were carefully stored, altered for future use, or gifted to noble women or the church. Some gowns were dismantled and reworked, precious trims and panels repurposed for new garments or altar cloths. A queen's wardrobe was also an archive of her life. Recorded in household accounts, detailed lists described each item. A kirtle of blue silk embroidered with swans, or a cloak lined with sable and bordered in gold. These entries weren't just inventories. They were history, written in thread and cloth. It's important to remember that these court artisans lived complex lives of their own. While they held no titles, many gained favor and prestige for their work. Some became trusted confidants. Others passed down their knowledge to daughters and apprentices, forming family legacies of craftsmanship. Their work, largely uncredited in the pages of history, lives on in museum cases and preserved portraits, a fine seam, an even row of pearls, a balanced composition of color and shape. These are the fingerprint of artisans who worked in silence, but left behind elegance. So when we admire the elaborate gowns of queens past, we are not just seeing status or power. We're seeing collaboration, a tapestry of skill, care, and human artistry. The queen may have worn it, but it was crafted by many, and every stitch tells their story. Imagine entering a great hall during a royal feast. Torches flicker against the stone walls, casting long shadows. The queen is seated at the high table, her gown a cascade of velvet, embroidered with shimmering gold emblems. But to the trained eye, this is more than a dress. It is a message woven in fabric, color, and design. In the medieval world, especially within the royal court, fashion was not merely decorative. It was strategic communication, a kind of visual language understood by nobles, diplomats, and even foreign visitors. Every element, from the cut of the sleeve to the symbol on a brooch, spoke of lineage, alliances, mood, and even unspoken intentions. Let's begin with heraldic imagery. Queens often wore garments adorned with the coat of arms of their natal family, their husband's dynasty, or both, often interwoven in complex patterns. This wasn't just familial pride. It was a statement of dynastic legitimacy. If the queen bore both her father's and husband's arms, it reminded onlookers of the powerful alliance that her marriage represented. These symbols weren't always painted or stamped. They were often embroidered in silk and metal threads. A lion, a fleur-de-lis, or a swan might be stitched onto a sleeve or cloak, creating a silent proclamation of identity and power. Observers would have known exactly what each motif meant, and what alliances or claims they might imply. Colors, too, held meaning. A queen appearing in deep blue, especially lapis-dyed garments, might be seen as emphasizing piety and wisdom, suitable for a religious celebration or moment of mourning. Gold and crimson signified wealth and divine right. White was often used to project purity and virtue, especially in portraits sent abroad for marriage negotiations. Even the structure and silhouette of a gown could send a message. Long trailing sleeves and high collars were not only fashionable, they also conveyed majesty and restraint, signaling that the queen did not labor, did not rush, and move with deliberate grace. The flowing nature of such garments made the wearer appear almost ethereal, especially during ceremonial processions. Accessories added more layers of meaning. A necklace bearing a cross might indicate devotion, while a girdle with charms could suggest fertility or protection. Some queens wore rings engraved with prayers or relics tucked into hidden pockets of their gowns, details known only to a few, but deeply meaningful. Others had signature items, like a favorite brooch, passed down through generations, worn at significant events to draw subtle connections with past queens. Fashion could also be used to send political signals. If a queen wore a garment fashioned in a style associated with a rival court, perhaps something from the Burgundian or Castilian fashion houses, it might spark rumors of sympathy or secret diplomacy. Similarly, refusing to wear certain colors or motifs could be interpreted as a form of protest or resistance, especially in times of tension. Portraits played a role in this visual storytelling. When a painting or tapestry of a queen was created, the clothing depicted often exaggerated symbolic elements to reinforce her message to posterity. A gown might be shown more elaborate than it was in life, the embroidery clearer, the crown taller, not to deceive, but to clarify. These were not casual likenesses. They were crafted narratives like visual treaties. The court was full of interpreters of these codes, ladies-in-waiting, foreign ambassadors, and artists, all trained to observe and analyze every detail. For instance, an ambassador might report home not just on the queen's words, but on what she wore, and what it could imply about her mood, her alliances, or her role in upcoming negotiations. It is remarkable to think that entire policies and perceptions could be influenced by a queen's wardrobe. In this sense, fashion was not frivolous. It was strategic power, woven thread by thread, planned with care and often rehearsed in private chambers before stepping into the public eye. Today, many of these meanings are lost to us, but preserved garments, written accounts, and paintings still whisper this intricate language, one where fashion was the script, and queens were both the authors and the messengers. So, the next time you see an image of a medieval queen, take a closer look. Beneath the embroidery and gemstones, beneath the velvet and lace, there may be an entire story waiting to be read. A tale of diplomacy, dynasty, and quiet strength told in fabric. As you rest now, perhaps with images of velvet and gold thread drifting softly through your thoughts, let's take a final, quiet glance at the enduring legacy of medieval queens and the royal fashion that once defined empires. The fashions worn by queens of the Middle Ages were never merely adornments. They were a language, a carefully constructed grammar of texture, color, and symbol. Each hemline whispered about tradition. Each embroidery hinted at diplomacy. Each jewel rested heavy with expectation. And though centuries have passed, their influence lingers. We still see echoes of their choices in modern couture, in royal weddings, state ceremonies, and designer runways. The long trains, the embroidery that tells a story, the crowns resting gently on styled hair. All these are faint reflections of the past, woven anew from modern eyes. Fashion houses today often draw on the rich textures and silhouettes of medieval design, not just because of their beauty, but because of the authority they radiate. Queens of old understood the power of presence, and that power continues to inspire. Museums, too, play their part in keeping these stories alive. Preserved garments, once worn by nobility, rest in softly lit glass cases. Visitors lean in, admiring the fine stitchwork, the subtle colors faded by time. These are not just artifacts. They are chapters in a quiet history, stitched by hand and worn with purpose. And books, so many books, continue to explore what it all meant. Fashion historians, costume designers, and curious minds alike continue to decode this visual language. They ask, why this fabric? Why that color? Why that particular pattern? And with each question, the queens speak again. There's a certain comfort in this continuity, in knowing that something as delicate as a silk ribbon or a gold-trimmed cloak can carry meaning across centuries, that while empires rise and fall, a piece of fashion, a personal, intimate expression of power, can endure. And so we close our story, gently folding the last layer of embroidered silk, setting aside the jewel belt, and letting the candlelight fade. Sleep now, with the echoes of royal halls and whispered secrets in velvet-lined corridors. Sleep, as a legacy of queens weaves softly through your dreams. And know that the history they wore still surrounds us, a quiet elegance that never truly faded.